Another Crown Jewels video. I hear you cry. Well, I just can't get enough of them, I'm afraid. Regalia is so interesting, not simply because these objects are great works of craftsmanship from the past, but they are icons too that are symbolic of the whole history and identity of a particular nation. And in this video, I look at the Crown Jewels of Denmark. Now, Denmark is a country that has a rather surprising constitutional and political history, and the regalia and the Danish coronation rites reflect that fascinating story. Denmark has an established monarchy that can be traced back in unbroken lineage to the 10th century, and is perhaps a few centuries older than that. The kingdom is usually said to have begun with Gorm the Old, who reigned from the 950s to the 980s from Jelling. Some of the earliest Danish kings, such as Knut II, were rulers of a mighty Scandinavian empire, and of course some, like him, were even kings of England. From the beginning, it seems that the succession to the crown of Denmark was regulated by election. But although Danish kings were formally elected, the succession was by and large informally hereditary. In 1448, King Christopher, who was sovereign of Denmark, Sweden and Norway in union, died without an heir, and there was no obvious successor within his wider family. The Council of State offered the throne then to Duke Adolphus of Schleswig, the senior member of the German princely house of Oldenburg and one of the most prominent nobles within the Danish realm. He declined the offer, and so it was then offered to Adolphus's nephew, Count Christian of Oldenburg, who became King Christian I of Denmark. All Danish sovereigns since can claim direct descent from Christian I. It should be said that from 1397, all Danish kings were kings of an empire of three kingdoms, Denmark, Sweden and Norway, which they held in a personal union. Sweden and Norway were always the junior partners in that union. In 1523, Sweden declared its independence. Then in 1814, following the Napoleonic Wars, Norway was first ceded to Sweden, and then in 1818 became an independent kingdom of its own, with a former French marshal, Jean-Baptiste Bernadette, as its sovereign. From the accession of Christian I in 1448 onwards, although the Danish throne continued in the hands of the House of Oldenburg, each new king was nominally elected by the Council of State. Now, this Council of State is called the Rigsrådet in Danish, a word that as an Englishman I am sure I am completely butchering in pronunciation. Any Danish speakers, please correct me in the comments box. I'd much appreciate to learn better. Thank you for all your support. If you enjoy my YouTube channel, don't forget that you can support my work further and help others see my content by liking, subscribing and sharing my videos. This Council of State was made up primarily of nobles, of bishops and ministers of the crown. On being offered the throne, the new king was required to sign a charter that then limited his powers to a greater or lesser extent. The coronation that followed the election had since the 14th century taken place in the Church of Our Lady of Copenhagen, Copenhagen Cathedral, and it followed the form of other European coronations. The king had to take an oath, he was then anointed, he was invested with the regalia, including the sword of state being placed in his hand, the orb and the sceptre. He was then crowned not by the bishops alone, but by the bishops and members of the Council of State together, to symbolise that they were the collective source of the king's authority, as is shown in this engraving of the coronation of Frederick II in 1559. You can see the huddle of bishops and nobles around the enthroned king as they place the crown upon his head. Then everything changes in the middle of the 17th century. In 1647, Prince Christian, the eldest son of Christian IV, died, and Christian's second son, Frederick, then became his heir. In 1648, when Christian IV dies, Frederick was duly elected by the Council of State as King Frederick III of Denmark. He was required to sign a punitive charter that curtailed his royal prerogative quite sharply and vested much of the royal power in the Council of State. The first decade of Frederick's reign would prove difficult for Denmark. There was wave after wave of conflict with Sweden over disputed territory, a dispute and conflict that in origin went back far into his father's reign. In late 1658, Copenhagen, the Danish capital, had even been besieged by the Swedes. In 1660, Denmark was on its knees financially, and the king declared a national state of emergency. With a groundswell of personal popularity, the perceived failure of the Council of State and inability to ensure the nation's defence, and with a good dose of persuasion that involved at one point locking them in, the representatives of the three estates of the Danish nation, the nobility, the clergy, and the burghers, the townsfolk, then declared Frederick an absolute monarch. The first thing Frederick did as an absolute ruler was to abolish the Council of State. Denmark then adopted an agnatic succession rule that was loosely based on Salic law and prevented women inheriting the crown unless all male relatives of the king, however distant, had been exhausted. And all of this was enshrined in the so-called King's Law, passed in 1665. A new form of Danish coronation, not really a coronation at all, but an anointing ceremony, was also enshrined in the King's Law to emphasise the king's divine right to rule. Gone was the oath entirely. It was considered superfluous. The king cannot be bound by his subjects, the law stated. Given that the king already had the authority to rule not by election but by divine right of succession, Danish kings were no longer invested with emblems of majesty and then crowned. They arrived for their anointing ceremony already dressed in their robes and regalia, crowned with the sceptre and orb and girded with the sword. They would be seated under a great canopy with the king laying aside his crown and regalia as he went to the altar to kneel and be anointed. The anointing was intended to empower the king with God's blessing and give him the Lord's powerful assistance for his already divinely ordained rule. Christian V, the son of Frederick III, was the first Danish absolutist king to receive the anointing in this manner. A new ceremony like this required a new location. Copenhagen Cathedral was eschewed, and the anointing of Danish kings took place in a private and more intimate setting of the castle chapel of their castle at Frederiksborg, constructed by Christian IV. To mark the change, a new set of regalia was also made: a new throne, a new crown, a new sword, and a new robe. There are a number of items of regalia that survive from before Denmark became an absolutist monarchy, but none of these predate the mid-16th century. The earliest element of the regalia is the old sword of state, which was made for King Christian III. This incredible sword and scabbard in Renaissance style were made in 1551 by the goldsmith Johann Sieb. During the old coronation, the sword was presented to the king and placed in his right hand, and then girded to him, much as at an English coronation. The earliest crown to survive is that of Christian IV, which was made ahead of his coronation on the 29th of August 1596. Christian was 11 when he came to the throne in 1588, and his coronation was delayed until he came of age. He was crowned in the Church of Our Lady of Copenhagen by the Bishop of Zealand, Peder Winstrup. As none of the earlier crowns of Denmark survive, it is likely that any material from them were reused in this new crown. The crown was made in the workshop of Deirik Firing in Odense, and he was assisted by a Nuremberg goldsmith called Corbinianus Sauer. I have to put my teeth in to say that name. It is an extraordinary example of the Renaissance goldsmith's craft, its decoration designed to complement Christian III's sword. Made of gold, decorated extensively with colourful enamel on both the back and the front, it is set entirely with table-cut diamonds and pearls. The circlet is topped with 10 elaborate fleurons, 6 large and 4 small. 3 of the large fleurons incorporate enamel images of the pelican in her piety, which was a popular medieval image representing Christ's sacrifice on the cross for the sake of mankind. The messaging is clear that the king should follow Christ's example and be prepared to sacrifice himself for his people. The remaining 3 large fleurons have depictions of the virtues. the cardinal virtues of fortitude and justice, and the Christian virtue of charity, represented as a suckling mother. The 4 smaller florons, which are filled with star-like sprays of diamonds, are flanked on each side by what appear to be mythical creatures in enamel, half man or woman and half dolphin. Denmark was not a rich country, and at times the crown and the regalia had to be pawned, and in August of 1628 Christian IV pawned the crown. He redeemed it again in 1633 and then had it repaired in Hamburg. During the Torstenson War, when the finances again were looking pretty bleak, Christian used the crown as security for a 15,000 rigsdaler loan from Gabriel Marcellus in Hamburg. The crown was only redeemed again in 1648 for the coronation of his son King Frederick III. Ahead of his coronation, Frederick added imperial arches to the crown and a monde and a cross to the top, which was subsequently removed by Christian V, who used the material and gems of these arches for his own crown, but more about that in a moment. If portraits of Christian IV, like this one, are indicative, there appears to have been a sceptre to match the crown, but this has long since disappeared. Presumably it was pawned too, and it was replaced in 1648. In fact, a number of new items of regalia were made by Frederick III in 1648 to replace lost items ahead of his coronation. The first of these is the sceptre, which was made by an unknown goldsmith in Copenhagen. It is a really beautiful piece. It terminates in a lovely fleuron in the form of an enamelled lily, from which then springs a small gold crown, all beautifully decorated with multicoloured enamel flowers. It is set with table-cut diamonds. The orb is a relatively simple piece, a gold globe which is decorated with bands of blue enamel. These and the cross on top are set with table-cut diamonds, and this is believed to have been made by a Hamburg goldsmith. The ampulla, used to contain the holy oil of anointing, is a really exquisite piece. A cylindrical lidded vessel, it is made of gold and has been painted with enamel representations of flowers. We have pansies, gazania, lily of the valley and rose, and it is further embellished with table-cut diamonds. It is, again, the work of an anonymous, a goldsmith from Copenhagen. It's such a pity that we can't put a name to such fine work. Although the crown and the sword from the early regalia were no longer used after 1660, the sceptre, the orb and the ampulla continued in use in the absolutist period. Then we come to the new regalia created for the new absolutist polity. It seems that King Frederick III was already contemplating the need for new symbols of sovereignty before he died, but the crown and the robe were left to his son Christian V to commission. Frederick did, however, commission in the 1660s an extraordinary new throne for the kings to sit in at their anointing. The throne was made by a very skilled cabinet maker called Bendik Skrotschilling. The influence for the construction and design of the throne was the ivory throne of King Solomon, with its attendant lions, described in the Bible at 1 Kings 10. Instead of ivory, the throne was of course made of narwhal tusks, which in the Middle Ages were believed to be unicorn horns, and Frederick seems to have been quite happy for people to believe they were. As King of Norway as well as of Denmark, he had a ready supply of these tusks from his northerly realms. The gilded orbs on the throne date from Frederick's time, but the bronze figures on the top, the back and the arms were apparently added during the reign of Christian V, and they appear to represent 2 sets of the 4 cardinal virtues: justice, temperance, fortitude and prudence. Frederick even ordered the making of lions to stand beside the arms of his new Solomonic throne. Not 2, but 3 enormous silver-gilt lions were commissioned sometime after 1664 by the goldsmith Ferdinand Küblich. At the anointing, these wonderful lions sat on either side and before the throne. For the first anointing ceremony of a king, that of Christian V, 2 new items of regalia were made: a new crown and a new kingly robe. A third item from the royal treasury, a fine sword, was also pressed into service. The new crown was made by the court goldsmith Paul Kurtz in Copenhagen sometime in 1670. As I said before, the arches, once added to Christian IV's crown, were removed from that to provide material and stones for this new crown. The crown is made of gold, which has a hammered surface texture, with only certain elements polished to give contrast. It consists of a circlet that is topped with 8 palmette leaves, from which then spring 8 arches. The arches are topped with a mond of pale blue enamel, on which is a cross of diamonds surmounted by a single sapphire. Most of the crown is set with table-cut diamonds of various size, with 1 or 2 rose-cut diamonds too. The front of the crown is made very clear by the use of a slightly larger gold panel decorated with palmette and set with the largest diamond, behind which is the royal monogram of Christian V in enamel. The band is set again with diamonds that are arranged in scrollwork patterns, between which are set 2 large table-cut garnets and 2 large sapphires, which have delicate black and white enamel mounts. Of the sapphires, the largest on the front of the crown is believed to have been in the royal collection since the reign of Christian I, the first king of the House of Oldenburg, and may well have been a gift to him from the Duke of Milan, Galeazzo Sforza, when the king visited Lombardy in 1474. The coronation robe is made of red silk velvet and is modelled on those of other European nations, and it is lined with white rabbit fur but edged round with ermine. The silk body of the robe has been embroidered with 1400 representations of the crown, worked in gold thread. Christian III's state sword, used at coronation ceremonies of old, was retired, and a new sword that became known as the anointing sword was worn by the king at his waist. This sword appears to have originated as a personal sword of Frederick III and may have been given to him by his father Christian IV in 1643 as a wedding gift. This is a sword for show and not for use. The hilt and the crossguard of the sword are decorated with enamel painted with colourful floral sprays, and it is richly set with table-cut and rose-cut stones. The scabbard has a shape and other decorative medallions to match this work, and it is believed that the hilt and the scabbard are the work of Lucas Schaller, a Hamburg goldsmith. We know very little of the Queen's regalia before the 3rd decade of the 18th century. We know a crown was made in 1648 for Queen Sophie Amalie of Brunswick, but this was dismantled in 1731 and the stone salvaged when a new crown was commissioned for the use of Queen Sophie Magdalene of Brandenburg-Kulmbach, the consort of King Christian VI. The crown made in 1731 was the work of the court goldsmith Frederick Fabricius of Copenhagen, and it's a smaller version in effect of the crown of Christian V. Made of gold, it has 8 arches springing from strawberry leaves. On top is a blue enamelled mond surmounted by a cross. The circlet is decorated with repoussé decoration of acanthus leaves. Also, ahead of the 1731 anointing, a new throne was commissioned for the use of the Danish Queen. It is made of silver gilt, the silver worked over a wooden frame, and was the work of Niles Johnson, a Copenhagen goldsmith. It has a canopy with 2 figures of reclining virtues on it, and in the centre a sunburst of rays surrounding the tetragrammaton, the name of Yahweh, the name of God in Hebrew. The throne is upholstered in cloth of silver. Personally, I think it is more ostentatious and bonkers than the king's throne. As well as its use for the anointing ceremony, the regalia had a secondary purpose at the funerals of Danish sovereigns. Danish kings had a rather elaborate lying in state. In the 17th and early 18th century, this took place in the chapel of the Frederiksborg Palace, where the anointing took place. But from the later 18th century onwards, it was transferred to the chapel of the Christiansborg Palace in central Copenhagen. A raised hearse or catafalque called a castrum doloris, a castle of grief, was erected with the coffin of the king placed on it under a large canopy. The royal robe, the crown of Christian V, were then placed on top of the coffin, while the rest of the regalia was placed at the head of the coffin, with the silver lions arranged around it. Now, the absolutist monarchy of Denmark ended in 1848 with the succession of Frederick VII to the throne. A new Danish constitution was promulgated in 1849 and Denmark became a constitutional monarchy. The anointing of Frederick VII's father, Christian VIII, in 1840 would prove to be the last Danish coronation, and the regalia has not been worn since. It is now on permanent display at the Rosenborg Castle. However, the regalia is still used at the time of a sovereign's death for the castrum doloris. The last time we saw it was in 1972 at the funeral of King Frederick IX, and presumably it will be seen again when Queen Margrethe dies. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.